Hi, welcome back. This is the second half of part 3 of Pirates, Smugglers, and the Making of the Modern World. In part 1, we went through the Barbarosas and their involvement with the Ottoman Empire. We saw how an empire seeking to expand in this early modern era might turn to pirates to assist it in that process. Now we're going to look at a very different case in the second half as we look at particularly the Portuguese. We'll also briefly talk about the Dutch, but mostly the Portuguese we're going to talk about in Asia and how their efforts to create a closed or at least monopolistic trading empire in Asia helped trigger a variety of types of piracy. In fact, we're also going to come up against the question of, well, who's a pirate? Is it the Portuguese who are pirates? Because they're saying it's the locals, particularly people in India, who are pirates, but perhaps some of the things the Portuguese are doing are forms of piracy as well, and the same with the Dutch. And we'll also look at the other issue that's a topic for our course, and that is smuggling. We really didn't discuss that with the Barbarosas because they weren't smugglers. They were really involved just in piracy. But in the case of the spice trade, which is a particular focus for the second half, we're also going to look in the latter part of today's second half at how the establishment or the attempt to establish a monopolistic system in spices also triggered a wide variety of smuggling activities within the Portuguese Empire itself. So we'll be looking at both piracy and how the attempt to establish monopoly triggers that, but we'll also look at how it encourages smuggling as well. Now, first of all, the thing we're going to focus on here is the spice trade and the attempt of the Portuguese to control that. There was a lot more to the Portuguese Empire in terms of trade, etc., that we'll briefly mention along the way, but this is the focus. This is what really provided for the significant part of Portugal's wealth coming out of Asia, and it's the area where the Portuguese were most intent on creating a truly monopolistic system. Now, first of all, the spice trade itself goes back thousands of years before the Portuguese ever got involved. It's a part of the history of the ancient world. Okay? Particularly the use of pepper, cloves, nutmeg, and other kinds of spices. Now, first of all, the use of spices is important to establish because, of course, today you would look at spices and say, well, gee, you can buy the stuff off the rack, in the supermarket, and maybe it's a little bit pricey for a can of nutmeg, but still hardly seems like something you can make a fortune over. And besides which, I don't really need nutmeg in my eggnog this year. I'll live without it, or whatever. I don't need ground pepper. So they don't seem to have the kind of allure that would lead people to try to build an empire over, that would lead people to piracy and to smuggling. But in fact, down through the centuries, they have been enormously valuable. The primary use of spices at this time in Europe was to deal with the lack of refrigeration. It's not that they didn't have electricity available, it's just they didn't have refrigeration. Now, if you're living in Northern Europe, of course, and Central Europe for that matter, during the winter you could cut out blocks of ice and use that at least in through the early spring to help preserve food. You bury it in the ground and put food with it, and that'll help preserve food for a time. But clearly, over the long term, in August, you're not going to find a lot of ice in France, right? So there is no really practical way to refrigerate food in any significant way for most people. You might put it beside a cold stream or something, but that's about as most you can do. So how do you preserve food? Well, you don't very well. Spices assist in that process. They can assist in inhibiting the deterioration of food. More importantly, they will also cover the taste of rancid meat. And this is really important because food, although for us in this society it may seem as sort of a given, it's just a matter of what am I going to eat and how much am I going to eat, exactly what do I want to supersize today besides myself. Food is not a major issue, but in early modern society, no matter how developed it was, or how wealthy it might be, the access to food was always a problem. Partly because of problems of transportation, partly because of problems of the weather and how it could affect accessibility to food. We saw the issue of warming and cooling of the Earth's climate and how that could affect growing seasons. Transportation, as I said, because food may be plentiful in one area but unavailable in another because it can't be easily transported. And then there's the issue of and the issue of preservation itself. So it was very important to be able to preserve food, but given the fact that food would deteriorate, one had to be able to eat food, particularly meats, that were perhaps not the most flavorful. In other words, if the stuff has already gone from green to gangrenous, you're still going to have to eat it because otherwise you're going to starve, unless you want to carve up one of your children, which also happens. But short of that, probably the most humane way of dealing with problems of preservation and the fact that food would tend to deteriorate was to put something on it that would make it taste at least palatable. So spices were important for this simple reason. They made non-palatable food palatable. You could eat it, even though you might not want to look at it. So you could drench it, as we often do today, even though the food is not deteriorating necessarily. But if you drench it in pepper, for example, or one of the other spices, cloves, etc., you can disguise, the fact that this particular form of animal protein has deteriorated to a great degree, and you can still eat it. This made spices extremely valuable. Now, beyond that, the fact is, down through the centuries, there was always attempts to control the flow of spices. Their price is determined not just by the fact that they are valuable in the preservation of food, but also by the fact that there are always groups, merchants, potentates, who are seeking to control the flow of spices to consumers. In other words, to keep their prices up by limiting access. Part of this was also facilitated by the fact that many spices grew in only select areas of the world. And if we look at a map of at least portions of Asia, we'll see some of the key areas. We've talked about the Spice Islands, which are out here in what is modern-day Indonesia. And they produced a variety of spices such as nutmeg, cloves, etc. And also, if we look towards India, and this is an area you're going to look at closely today, and you see the southern Indian coast, here the city of Calicut and Cochin just to its south, these were key areas for the growing and export of pepper. Now, in addition, the major spice routes from the Spice Islands flowed through here, through the Straits of Malacca, and onto the west coast of India. And it was from here, particularly from Gujarat, here in the north, that spices were then shipped across the Middle East and to Europe. And down through the centuries, particularly in the time approaching the period when we're going to talk about in the 1500s, it was Arab merchants and Arab seamen who controlled much of this trade, who were responsible for shipping spices to the Middle East and then on into Europe. So this is the key route that controls the flow of spices. And it had been going on since ancient times. It had been used, as I said, for thousands of years. Given the limited areas where spices could grow, given the very long journeys that were necessary to transport these goods into Europe, prices were not surprisingly high, given their value, given attempts to control the trade, given the fact that they are located, they grow in only select areas that are far from Europe itself. This made spices an extremely valuable product. In fact, things like peppercorns were often used as a form of currency by people because they contain such intrinsic value. This is the area, of course, where the Portuguese will attempt to insert themselves and create their own trading empire. Now, as of 1500, the date we usually start things off here, the trade in spices was being handled by an extraordinary variety of groups. Trade in general, in the Indian Ocean, along the coast of India itself, into the reaches of the Spice Islands themselves, was highly fragmented. No single power dominated these routes, or even a major portion of them. A variety of city-states, principalities, etc., had a role in this. This was a highly multinational trade. And in many ways that helped keep the peace because no single power was trying to impose itself and really felt capable of imposing itself upon the spice trade. This is not a situation like the Mediterranean, where we have two great powers converging after each other, the Habsburgs on one side, the Ottomans on the other, and doing battle over controlling this major commercial region. Instead, we have an innumerable number of small powers who are trading in this area. Now, I will say that by this time, the Ottomans have a major stake in all of this as well. They are interested in handling of the spice trade because it comes directly through their empire once it enters the Middle East. Many of their merchants are involved in the trade, but the Ottomans themselves, again, are not attempting to extend a line of control from the Middle East all the way to the Spice Islands to actually control the trade itself, because they know inevitably it's going to come through their provinces anyhow. It has to come up through the Middle East, essentially through areas like Syria and Egypt, and it will be a part of their commerce and their trade simply by the logic of their location. So they have really no need to try to extend their authority out into the Indian Ocean, but they are very much a vital part of this trading system. It is that environment into which the Portuguese will enter as they establish their trading empire. And we saw the beginnings of this when we talked about trading empires last week. The kind of empire that the Portuguese established is very different from the kind of empire that the Spanish had or the Ottomans. You look at the Spanish and you look at the Ottoman empires, as much as these are naval powers, the fact is these are primarily land-based empires. I mean, when Charles thinks of empire, he has Spain, he has the Holy Roman Empire, parts of Italy, the Netherlands, and of course he has this growing land empire in the Western Hemisphere in the New World. And as for the Ottoman Empire, they control most of what is the modern-day Middle East, much of the Balkans, most of North Africa. This is a massive land-based empire, but not so the Portuguese. As we saw last time, when the Portuguese began their empire, they began by setting up a series of trading outposts. These were known as feitorias. It would roughly translate as factory. But what they really are is an armed trading outpost. And they had set these up along the west coast and the east coast of Africa and would continue to do the same kind of thing as they ventured out into Asia. In India, Goa, for example, is one of their major trading outposts. We'll come back to that. We'll talk about Goa a little bit more later. But this is the method by which they operate. And with each of these feitorias comes a factor. The factor is the man in charge of the trading outpost. He is responsible to the Portuguese king for the management of trade and to see to it, in particular, that the crown benefits from this trade. There are always private traders in the Portuguese Empire. In other words, individual merchants who are doing business within the empire. But as we will see, particularly as we get to Asia, the crown wants to have certain areas of exclusivity, particularly the spice trade. What the Portuguese crown is going to want is for these factors to control that spice trade for them so it operates for the exclusive benefit of the King of Portugal. Now, one of the early trades they got involved in, and we don't have to go into detail here because we talked about it last week, is the slave trade. And this becomes one of the methods by which the Portuguese can generate wealth within their empire, supplying labor both to their own sugar plantations off the northwest coast of Africa and later to plantations in the Western Hemisphere in places like Brazil and southern parts of what became the United States, etc. Now, another factor to understand in appreciating how the Portuguese operate is that, as we saw a little bit with the Barbarossas earlier, trade and warfare often went hand in hand. As we saw, merchants often turned to piracy in order to make a living. They were merchants primarily, but occasionally stealing somebody else's goods was certainly not something that was beneath them. But beyond that, political powers often used their power to expand trade opportunities. It was considered fairly common practice among the Europeans that you go out with a warship and establish trade opportunities for your merchants. And the Portuguese would be extremely assertive in that regard. And when they sailed into a port, they didn't even know what the place was called. They didn't know who these people were. Usually they came in, if not with guns blazing, then at least with cannon loaded and ready to go. I mean, their first response was, okay, we want to do trade, otherwise we'll kill you. That's even without asking, who are you people, how might we get along. Their first reaction was, well, we're here to do trade, but if you don't want to trade, we'll kill you. And we'll see that's often their response as they deal with various groups involved in the spice trade. This was sort of an extreme version of European experience, but it was not entirely out of common practice among European powers. But the Portuguese were particularly known for that aspect of their system. And an example of this is the Kingdom of Zimbabwe in southeast Africa. I have a map of Africa, so let's take a look and just show you where it is. Of course, what the Portuguese had done is they had come down the coast of Africa, establishing a series of trading posts along here. Remember the Congo River, the Kingdom of the Congo, one of the places they did it. And here in Southeast Africa, they came as well, already armed with a military force, and they made an alliance with the Kingdom of Zimbabwe, an African kingdom, which was a fairly powerful political force here in Southeast Africa. The purpose of that alliance was to begin a series of attacks on Arab Muslim merchants who operated along the east coast of Africa. This whole area of Africa had a thriving trade in the early 1500s that went back a number of centuries. And particularly influential were Arab traders who came down the coast and established some of these port cities, some of these trading centers, and had active trade with the various African kingdoms and societies here and in the interior. The Portuguese idea right from the beginning when they showed up in East Africa was to go after these people. They were going to go in and attack one major port after another. The first thing that the Emperor of Zimbabwe did was to massacre the Arab traders that were in his region at the time as a sign of good faith, that he was an ally of the Portuguese. And then the Portuguese would use this as a base to begin their assaults on the various ports on the east coast of Africa. So this is fairly standard operating procedure for the Portuguese. It's not a matter of, gee, let's not go negotiate a nice mutual trade agreement, reciprocal trade between ourselves and people involved in Malacca and elsewhere and the spice trade. Their first option was, well, we'll go look, but if we don't get immediate cooperation and if they don't agree to exclusive trade with us, we'll attack them. And that's pretty much what they did. The Portuguese motto as they sailed into Asia was that they were there for Christians and spices. That didn't mean necessarily they were looking to find Christians, although there were long-standing myths about Christian kingdoms that existed far from Europe and the Mediterranean. What they really meant was that they were there to convert people, if possible, by one means or another, to Christianity, and that their other purpose was, of course, to monopolize the spice trade, so that they had both altruistic, at least from their perspective, motives, and also very common pragmatic motives, making money by controlling spices. In both cases, both in dealings in religion and in commerce, the Portuguese tended to be rather violent and obnoxious. No, don't mean to demean the Portuguese, but that was a fact. That was the way they were. They tended to go in, and what they wanted was to convert people to Christianity if they weren't already Christian, and most of them weren't, and they tend to be rather pushy about it. And the same with commerce. And we will see this creates a particular problem with one of the key trading areas for the spice trade, particularly the pepper trade, is that the Portuguese just don't want to go in there and be, one among equals. They want to take over. And that's not the way trading patterns worked in this part of the world, because there was such a multiplicity of groups and interests involved. The first person to arrive on the west coast of India is Vasco da Gama. And he encounters the Zamorin of Calicut. The Zamorin is the hereditary leader of Calicut. Calicut is a major port. It its interior is an area where much of the pepper that's produced in India at this time is produced, and here Vasco da Gama has come upon this vital center. Here we go, right here in the southwest portion of India's coast, right at this spot, okay, is Calicut. And Cochin is just below, which I'm going to mention again in a moment. And if we look up the coast a bit, we see Goa. This became a major outpost for the Portuguese. And Gujarat, just beyond that, in the north, that is a key spice trading center for both pepper coming out of India itself and for the spices coming out of the Spice Islands, as we mentioned. But for the moment, we have Vasco da Gama showing up at Calicut and meeting the Zamorin. Now, this part of the coast of India is known as the Malabar Coast, and we'll see the use of the term later on in another context, but that's what it's called, is the Malabar Coast. Now, one of the things that happens in these encounters, and it demonstrates that this really was a situation where the Portuguese were getting involved in encountering societies they know little about, is that when Vasco da Gama met the Zamorin and, of course, began a discussion on religion, because it's very important to the Portuguese in terms of converting people to Christianity, he discovered that he wasn't a Muslim. Just rather surprising, because, of course, Muslim merchants abounded in Calicut. They were heavily involved in the pepper trade. And when the Zamorin starts explaining some of his religious beliefs, it occurs to Vasco da Gama, without pushing the point, that maybe he is a Christian. Maybe this is some form of Christianity, that these people have been separated from the original roots of Christianity in the Mediterranean for centuries upon centuries, and perhaps their belief patterns have changed somewhat, but maybe it's another type of Christianity. Well, actually, they were Hindus, which is not exactly Christian and from. But in any case, he goes back and reports to the Portuguese king that, we might still have a chance to create an alliance here, in particular with the Zamorin of Calicut, because maybe they are some kind of Christian. It's just an ancient form of Christianity that we're not familiar with. Well, of course, that wouldn't prove to be the case. In any case, the major rivals that the Portuguese face are Muslim merchants, Arab merchants in particular from the Middle East, who have for centuries been heavily involved in this trade. And immediately, there is a rivalry between the two sides. The Muslim merchants do not want to see the Portuguese get a foothold, and the Portuguese, of course, not only want a foothold, they want the whole place. They just don't want a little shop on the wharf somewhere. They want to control the entire spice trade. This conflict between the Portuguese and the Arab traders leads almost immediately to a riot against the Portuguese. No doubt triggered by the Arab merchants. They knew when there was trouble coming, and they wanted the Portuguese out now. Better to get rid of them now. So there was a riot. The rioters attacked merchants who have come with the Gama, and this immediately leads to a certain amount of bad feeling. But in any case, da Gama goes home, makes his report, and then the next expedition is sent out under Pedro Cabral in 1501. Now, when Cabral shows up, he begins the festivities by bombarding Calicut. He brings his naval vessels in, and they start firing cannon and attacking the city. This, it didn't happen as a result of, oh, gee, they attacked us first. This is just an attack. What it was da Gama wasn't too crazy about the way he was treated and the anti-Portuguese riot that occurred. He assumed that the ultimate responsibility was with the Zamorin, that he had done nothing about it. So he attacked. This was the Portuguese sort of approach to things. Shoot first and ask questions later. They expected to get some concessions. Now, the Zamorin's point of view, even though his city was being bombarded, was that he didn't mind the Portuguese coming and trading. That was fine with him. But the fact is, like so many other potentates involved in the spice trade, he had a multinational community that he was dealing with, among them Arab merchants, but others as well. And as long as they all wanted to join in together and compete with each other, that's fine. But if somebody really wanted to dominate the trade, that became a problem, because that would sacrifice the interests of the much larger group that was involved. So the Zamorin turns down Cabral's request, which came at the end of a cannonade, to have the Portuguese come in and essentially dominate trade in Calicut. The Portuguese then moved down the coast to Cochin, which I showed you on the map earlier, another kingdom whose ruler was more willing to cooperate. Cochin had often been under the thumb of Calicut, so the Cochin ruler was more amenable to allying with the Portuguese. He figured this would give him greater sway and greater influence. He would be less under the domination of Calicut in the future. In 1503, Vasco da Gama returns. Cabral has left, and da Gama comes back. Now, da Gama is back to try once again to establish a trading relationship with Calicut. Why Calicut? Because it is the most important port for the pepper trade at this point, and therefore they really want to focus their activities there. So negotiations resume with the Zamorin. The problem is, as it was in the past, that what the Portuguese are asking for is, gee, we'd just like to have some trade here. What they are saying is, no, we want to dominate trade. We want you to expel all the Muslim merchants. And the Zamorin just can't do that because, his whole system is built on this multiplicity of traders for pepper coming out of the interior into Calicut. So once again, the Portuguese turn to their usual method, and they launch another naval bombardment of the city to try to convince the Zamorin that he should change his mind and that he better deal exclusively with the Portuguese. As he's leaving the harbor, Vasco da Gama also attacks a group of fishermen who are there in the harbor, but who are clearly fishermen. They're clearly not Arab merchants. And he massacres perhaps 400 of them, just sinks their vessels and kills them. Why? As another sign to the Zamorin that he better cooperate, because the Portuguese had tremendous naval power that they were willing to use against the Calicut Zamorin if he was unwilling to cooperate. And the Portuguese at this time do have an advantage. And I think I mentioned this before in talking about trading empires. We looked at the galleys. Well, the Portuguese now are using pure naval sailing vessels, and they have equipped them with cannon that run through portholes on either side of the ship. Obviously, if you don't have all those oarsmen, if it's just a sailing vessel, now you can use those portholes in the side of the ship to stick cannon out of. And up to this time, other naval forces were not using that kind of naval armament. Generally speaking, you might have a cannon in the bow, cannon in the stern, but other than that, usually ships were not heavily armed in that form. Most of it was done, again, by boarding practices, so you had pikes and swords, etc. But the Portuguese have raised this to a new level with these portholes in the side of the ship that have cannon in them. They are capable of inflicting considerable damage on other naval vessels and even on a city as a result of this new type of armament. They won't have that advantage very long, but in the short term it's rather impressive, and they're trying to use it to gain an advantage in Calicut. However, that having failed, they focus their attention, at least for the immediate future, on Cochin, where they can also get pepper, but not as advantageous a price. And they also begin operating in Gujarat. Gujarat because it is the center of spice trade in general. It's not just pepper from India, it's the spices coming from the Spice Islands that are brought to Gujarat and then traded. Now, they're not going to be able to dominate at this point, and they're not going to be able to overwhelm Gujarat. It's simply too large a political entity at this point, but this is their alternative for the moment. So what has happened up to this stage is that the Portuguese have sought a monopoly of the pepper trade coming out of Calicut. But for the Zamorin, the decision to grant that monopoly would have been economic suicide at this time. His whole economy has been based on this multilateral trading network with Arab traders and others from Africa and so forth. He can't afford to make that kind of concession. So to preserve his own society, to preserve his own economy, he has rejected that, and so far successfully. the Portuguese may be capable of inflicting considerable damage by naval bombardment, but they're certainly not in a position where they could invade and overrun Calicut. And their ability to stay and continue a naval blockade, for example, is extremely limited. They don't have the kinds of bases and kind of support that they could do that either. So in the short term, they can inflict periodic damage, but they really can't overwhelm Calicut at this stage. Now, at the heart of all of this, again, is pepper coming out of the interior of India into Calicut and being shipped out from there. The viewpoint of the Portuguese after their failed attacks is that all ships coming out of Calicut are pirate ships. Now, you may ask, oh, what's the logic of this? I mean, this trade has been going on for centuries, thousands of years. How can the Portuguese suddenly decide that just because a ship comes out of Calicut, that it's a pirate ship? Well, that was a definition that the Portuguese had designed. Now, we claim a right to control this trade. So if you are sailing a vessel out of Calicut and challenging our right to control the trade, then you are a pirate. This brings us to this question, and we'll come back, revisit it in a few minutes. Who's a pirate here? I mean, the Portuguese have come. Under what authority have they bombarded this city? Under what authority do they have a right to exclusive control over the spice trade? And who has given them authority to attack ships coming out of Calicut just because Calicut won't agree to be part of this monopolistic system that the Portuguese want to create? Now, one of the problems for the growers of pepper at this time is that the Portuguese attacks are creating difficulties for them. They do have to get their pepper out and get it sold, and the Portuguese, they certainly can't overrun Calicut, but they can cause serious problems by attacking the city and then following up by attacking merchant vessels that are coming out of Calicut bearing pepper from the interior. Another problem that the growers find is that even when they deal with the Portuguese, that the Portuguese insist on paying the lowest possible price. So even when Cochin merchants are dealing with the Portuguese, they find that the Portuguese are the lowballers of pepper merchants. In other words, the Portuguese figure they're going to make a fortune on this trade. And one of the ways of ensuring that fortune is they already know prices are high in Europe. But in addition to that, they're going to insist on paying low prices at the source. Why? Because they figure if they can establish a monopoly, you'll have to accept whatever price we give you. Otherwise, there's no trade. There's no money at all. So in addition to the attacks that they're imposing, there is the fact that even when the Portuguese deal with local merchants, they develop a reputation as people who want to pay you rock-bottom dollar for your product. In addition to that, as the Portuguese do get established in trade along India's coast, they themselves violate their own rules. Even though they are establishing supposedly an exclusive trade, the fact is that Portuguese merchants themselves, one, violate the trading exclusions. In other words, a Portuguese merchant will gladly trade spices with anybody if he gets the chance. He's not going to just ship them dutifully home to Portugal if he can sell it for a higher price along the way. And secondly, Portuguese merchants on their own will engage in piratical activities. Just like merchants back in the Mediterranean, you're having a bad year, things didn't work out, you lost your cargo in a storm, and you've sailed all the way to the west coast of India. Well, you don't want to go home empty-handed, but you have nothing to trade for the spices. Okay, well, here's an Arab ship full of spices, I'll go attack them. So this system was further flawed by the fact it wasn't as if the Portuguese were offering this secure system, that once we come in and establish the monopoly, everything is going to function smoothly. You can be sure that you can sell your spices to the Portuguese merchant who will sell them in Portugal at these high prices. It'll be a nice closed, efficient system. Even the Portuguese were violating the exclusivity of their own system. Now, the Portuguese tried to maintain that through a convoy. In other words, they would send a convoy of ships, including warships, to engage in the trade. A whole This was a long-term voyage, could take 9, 12 months, easily on one end. Therefore, they would send armed vessels with the merchant fleet in order to secure the spices and bring it back. Along the way, another purpose of these convoys, as they did begin to engage in the spice trade in India, was to attack Arab merchant vessels or any vessels that were being sailed by Islamic merchants and Islamic navigators. The expression of hanging the Moors from the spars, meaning if it's an Arab vessel, we just attack it. So it was not just a matter of protecting their own merchant vessels and their own cargoes. They were also using the availability of warships that they had to attack other traders who were involved in the trade at this time, even if it was in the open sea. So this isn't just a problem for Calicut. It's becoming a general problem for people involved in trade between the West Indian coast and the Middle East, because the Portuguese are waging open warfare on merchants and traders in this period, in this region of the world. As far as their source of spice, much of it comes from Cochin at this time because, again, their relationships with the Zamorin of Calicut are less than positive. He is still not willing to make any major concessions. All of this is creating substantial problems, not only for the Zamorin, but for the growers in the interior. They have certain alternatives that they're going to have to deal with because the Portuguese come along periodically and attack the port. They're out there attacking any vessel that leaves Calicut as a pirate vessel, and even if you're not leaving Calicut, they may attack you anyways because you're an Arab trader and they're trying to chew up the Arab trade in spices, get rid of it, and replace it with their own monopoly. So what are the pepper growers to do? One solution in these Malabar alternatives was to trade and move their trade inland. If we go back to the map, here we go. Okay, you're here. Let's see. Here you are down Calicut, okay? And you really want to get to Gorat. One way of doing it, although it's slow and has its own dangers in terms of being attacked, is to move your trade inland and to get it up to Gorat in that fashion. And some of the trade out of Cochin and out of the Calicut, out of the pepper-growing regions down here, went along an interior route to get up into Gorat to avoid the Portuguese, who, of course, sailing here off the coast and are more than anxious to attack anybody that's coming out of Calicut or anybody who's an Arab merchant. The other alternative was to use the sea route. I'll better go back to the map, not to confuse you too much. But again, just to find a small area along the coast and get a boat and take the boat up the coast. Now, to do this, the people of Calicut, Cochin, and other areas turned to vessels known as paros. These were small, fast sailing vessels. One of their major advantages, besides their speed, was their size, that they could try to outrace the Portuguese vessels, but when they couldn't, they could also sail into small coves where the large seagoing Portuguese vessels simply couldn't venture without danger of running aground. So the paros were actually running a vast smuggling operation, if you will, at least from the perspective of the Portuguese. Piratical in some ways. Piratical, why? Because at times they would actually attack Portuguese merchant vessels. They would use their own small boats to attack Portuguese merchant vessels that they found near the coast. So from the perspective of the Portuguese, the paros vessels represent smuggling and piracy. Of course, from the perspective of the interior pepper growers, the answer is, look, this is the only way we can do business. You people are cutting off our lifeline. You want to pay us bottom dollar if we sell to you. If we try to put it through Calicut, you attack the port, and if we send it through another port, you're attacking all kinds of vessels out in the ocean anyways. So you're leaving us no alternative. So here we have the paros, this fleet of boats, small boats, is really, from the Portuguese perspective, a group of smugglers and pirates. From their own perspective, they're simply people who are trying to do business as usual, but the Portuguese are interfering, so they're taking other alternative routes to achieve the same end, to get their spice sold. Now, from, again, the Portuguese perspective, the Malabar coast, this whole area in southern India, from Calicut down, is infested by pirates. Now, for the Portuguese sailors, their stories when they get home are rife with the stories of the pirates of the Malabar coast. On the other hand, as I was just pointing out, from the perspective of many of those people called pirates, it was the Portuguese who were the pirates, because they had come into a multinational trading system and had tried to impose a monopoly. And all they were doing was trying to survive as good businessmen will. So for the Portuguese, the definition, in fact, they come to call pirates malvares, which means anybody sailing on the Malabar coast. This was the term that they used. When they talked about malabares, they were talking about pirates. And when they were talking about pirates, were all this conglomeration of small merchants, pepper growers, etc., who were engaged in this trade and trying to get their trade up to Gujarat, and who at times also attacked Portuguese vessels in order to gain more money. Because if the Portuguese vessel happened to have spice on it, and Paros happened to find it in an opportunity where they could overwhelm it by their sheer numbers, they'd do so. But from the Portuguese perspective, these are all pirates. Now, the situation has still not been resolved with the Zamorin of Calicut. As all of this has evolved, as the Portuguese turned to Cochin, as they turned to Gujarat, as they began to attack sort of indiscriminately vessels that were sailing off the west coast of India, as all this has gone on, the Zamorin of Calicut has continued to defy them. And one of the reasons that he was able to do that was because he had, at his command, a naval force of his own. It was commanded by a powerful family known as the Coon Jolly Marakar. The Coon Jolly Marakar family were essentially, they've been described as the hereditary admirals of the Zamorin. In other words, this family, this clan, if you will, this extended family, had provided the naval forces for the Zamorin down through the centuries. And they, in turn, after the early bombardments, turned on the Portuguese and became regular harassers of the Portuguese, and in fact inflicted a number of defeats on the Portuguese Navy in these years in the 1500s. Perhaps most famous was Coon Jolly II, who was considered perhaps the greatest of the admirals, and Coon Jolly III, who established this powerful fortress near Calicut called Katakai. Here in India, we have in Calicut a naval force that would be comparable to, the Navy of Charles V or the Navy commanded by Andrea Doria, in the sense that it is and has been for some time the recognized naval force of an established political power. And it, not surprisingly, as the opportunities have arisen, has turned upon the Portuguese, who have threatened the future of Calicut and has inflicted damage upon the Portuguese Navy and upon Portuguese merchant vessels. And in fact, in two major naval encounters in 1528 and 1538, they inflicted particularly serious setbacks to the Portuguese, making it far more difficult for them to continue their raids upon Calicut. Now, the story of the Coon Jolly is this, that in Western histories of this period, they were described as pirates. And the Portuguese treated them as pirates. When they were captured, their lives were not very long because they'd quickly be executed by the Portuguese. And they were seen simply and purely as pirates. Yet they are recognized by the Zamorin of Calicut as his naval force. And through much of the 1500s, this remained a reality. So we have another example here. Besides the Paros, here we have the Coon Jolly, who are not just traders and merchants trying to continue to trade despite the monopolistic practices of the Portuguese. Here, these people are really the official navy of Calicut, and yet they too are deemed pirates and treated as pirates by the Portuguese. And often when the Portuguese talked of the Malabares, what they were talking about was the Coon Jolly, this naval force of the Zamorin of Calicut. Now, in time, as the Portuguese gained greater control over trade in the region, they were able to wear the Zamorin down. And eventually, his successor concedes in 1588 to allow the Portuguese to settle in Calicut. So he is clearly backing away from the position of his predecessors. He has to face the reality that the Portuguese have come to be the dominant force, at least temporarily, in the coast, off the western coast of India. Now, the Coon Jolly adamantly opposed this. They had continued to fight against the Portuguese, and they continued to see themselves as the great force preventing Portuguese domination. And indeed, Coon Jolly IV became known as King of the Moors. In other words, as the power even more important than the Zamorin in terms of challenging the Portuguese. But the reality of the alliance between the Zamorin of Calicut and the Portuguese finally spells doom for the Coon Jolly, and they will no longer serve as the naval force of the Zamorin, and they will pass into history as still an important, significant family, but not holding that position as really admirals of the Zamorin that they had held in the past. So after a long period of resistance that stretches over much of the 16th century, eventually the Coon Jolly are forced out of this position, and the Zamorin, accepting the reality of Portuguese dominance, makes an alliance with the Portuguese, ending this period of resistance. But again, we see another case where, saying who's a pirate is a little bit difficult, because in both the case of the Paros and the Coon Jolly, we're dealing with people who, first of all, were simply trying to carry on their own business as they had in the past and avoid the monopoly created by the Portuguese, and two, the Coon Jolly, who are a recognized naval force for this state system called Calicut, and who are trying to defend the interests of that state system against the Portuguese. But in both cases, they go down, at least in Western history, as pirates. Now, the issue of smuggling in this whole process. Smuggling was rampant in the great monopoly that the Portuguese had established. The monopoly is set up to benefit, of course, the Portuguese king. In Lisbon, in the Portuguese capital, there had been established early on the Casa de Indias. And what it is, the House of the Indies is how I translate. It is essentially a customs house, but has greater authority and power than just a customs house. It isn't just a place where customs duties are collected. It essentially is the control point for the trading empire that stretches out into the Spice Islands in the far western Pacific. Here, all trade is accounted for. Licenses to engage in trade are issued. And, of course, custom duties are collected. So all of this trade coming from the Spice Islands, from India, etc., was to be funneled through this customs house in Lisbon, the Casa de India. Now, officially there was a monopoly on spices for the king. All spices are to be funneled into a trade system that is for the exclusive benefit of the king. They will come to the Casa de Indias, it's controlled by the king, and then the Casa will arrange for the sale of the spices to merchants in Portugal, and then they'll be distributed into Europe from there. Now, in this exclusive system, of course, there is still a distinction between Christians and Muslims, because the penalties for Muslims who are caught smuggling are a lot higher than it is for a Christian. If you're caught as a Muslim, you can pretty well count your days on one hand or less. On the other hand, there are penalties for Christians, but they're not nearly as severe. And again, reflecting this idea that the Portuguese were really adamant about driving Arab traders out of the spice trade that they had such an influence over for so long. Now, in addition to controlling the spice trade, in general, the Portuguese established a license system. It's called the Catarse system. You have to buy a Catarse in order to gain a license to do trade. What this really meant was that the Portuguese are saying no trade in the areas that we dominate through our naval power, can engage in free trade. If you want to trade and you're a Hindu or Muslim merchant, that's fine, but you better be carrying a license that we've issued. If you don't have one and we stop you, you have to pay for one. If you don't pay for it, we seize your cargo. And pretty much the price of the license was usually the price of the cargo, so it was one and the same thing. This, again, can be seen as a form of piracy. I mean, pirates, in other instances, often run protection systems. The Chinese pirates, for example, ran protection systems. In other words, local merchants had to pay protection every month, otherwise their vessels would be raided. Well, the Portuguese are basically doing the same thing. I mean, it's basically a form of piracy saying, yeah, you can trade here, but only if you pay for one of these licenses. Now, despite the official monopoly in spices, the fact is the king often granted permissions to private traders to engage in the trade as well. So there is already a loophole. It is a monopoly technically, but certain privileged individuals were granted permission to engage in the spice trade as well. So already, it's not a perfectly sealed system where only those trading on behalf of the king himself are allowed to engage in the spice trade. Not surprisingly, this system, which tried to exclude so many and already had a loophole with private traders, encouraged a good deal of contraband or smuggling. The first and most fundamental reason for that was simply price differential. Now, the Portuguese are paying the lowest possible price for spices because of the areas they control. Then they are selling for the maximum possible price when they bring the stuff back to Europe, where they again are attempting to maintain a monopoly. So these artificial price differentials are themselves a tremendous inducement to smuggling. If I can get a hold of some spice, some pepper in West India, or if I can go to Malacca and get some nutmeg, etc., even a little box of it, and get that back to Portugal or get it into Europe somehow, I can make a fortune. Because Portugal has helped create, as have previous people who tried to control the trade, and the Portuguese are not the only ones that did this, but because of that price differential that they have helped create by creating this monopoly, by restricting the trade, it's an inducement to anyone and everyone who has any access to the spices to try to smuggle some of it because you can make so much money. One of the basic rules of smuggling. That's why smuggling occurs. Price differential. Now, in addition to that, encouraging the smuggling was the fact that we're not dealing with modern governments here. They do not have the ability to check every shipment of goods coming in. Even today, the fact is, for example, in the United States, only about 10% of the containers brought into this country, and you have a pretty good idea how many containers are brought into this country if you look at the Port of Houston or any major port. Only about 10% of them are checked by customs. They just can't do anymore. There's too many of them. In an earlier era, you have far fewer officials. As we'll see, bureaucracy was not very efficient to begin with, so they can't do that. Instead, what they generally do is just count the number of, like if you're bringing in 10 bales of cloth from India. Okay, we just count the bales, 10 bales, and the duty is on per bale. So it's 10 bales, we count it. We don't bother looking inside to find out, one, is that in fact what you've got in there? And two, how much of it do you have? Point one is, okay, it says it's bales of cheap cotton from India. Might be, but it might also be expensive silks. But we're too busy to check. So it could be a completely different product. And two, we're really not checking to find out, well, how much, even if it is cotton, how much cotton is really in there. You say it's only, half full. Well, I don't have time to check. So this basic idea that we just count the number of bales or boxes being brought off, we don't look inside them, needless to say, led to a lot of cheating in the process. Very easy to cheat by stuffing other stuff in there or telling them that it's a different product than what you have it labeled as. The bizalos were the boxes in which spices were carried. And in fact, the accounting was done based on these number of boxes, number of bizalos. The idea of smuggling was basically, how do you hide some of these boxes? You got a little box like this, look like a jewelry box. If you're bringing in a bale of cotton, You could hide 10 boxes like that easily in that bale of cotton and just say, well, it's a bale of cotton, Okay, that's all you're taxed on. They don't know that you're smuggling spices, which you have no right to bring in at all. Beyond that, there was, as I've talked about before, and this became classic with the Portuguese and with other trading empires, ships that were built specifically with areas below decks. In other words, you have the lower deck, but below that is a large space that's left open so you can stuff it full of smuggled goods. And then individual sailors, of course, were extremely creative in where they could hide spices. If you can think of a place in your body that you can insert anything larger than a Q-tip, a sailor was probably hiding spices in it. And needless to say, it became a little difficult. You're going to strip search everybody getting off the ship. Sometimes they would do this when they get really upset about smuggling, but most of the time you can't do that. Sailors found in an intricate number of ways in which they could find places to hide spices and bring them back. Another trick that was used, and we'll see this done in modern times as well, is transshipping of goods. Okay? Officially, you're a merchant, and you're in India, you're in the Spice Islands, and yes, you're bringing spices back, but you see, you're not bringing them into Europe. You're only taking them to Angola. So the restrictions on you don't apply because you are not threatening the monopoly in Europe. What you do is you take the stuff, drop it in Angola, and that's really near the Kingdom of the Congo on the west coast of Africa, and say, well, that's as far as I'm taking it. I brought it to this Portuguese outpost, but I only meant the spices to go that far. Okay, fine, then you're not interfering with the system, which is focused in Europe. Then you have a brother merchant take the spices across to the New World and sell them there. And for all you know, they'll wind up back in Europe eventually anyways. You can trade them with the colonies of Spain, etc., wherever. So transshipping is another form of smuggling in this case. I mean, you can transship goods illegally too, but in this case what it means is you give a false final destination. You're saying that it's only going as far as Angola, but of course what you're really going to do is ship the stuff out of the system into the New World. Another way of dealing with the problem of control over spices was to offload goods before you got back to Lisbon. In other words, you'd get off the coast, and before you had to go to the Casa de Indias and have your goods inspected, you unloaded half your cargo on small vessels that then rode into shore and carried the spices or whatever else you had smuggled onto the coast and then into the European trading system. Another common pattern. There were laws forbidding the ships that went in convoy from contacting each other. They were to sail a certain distance from each other. They were not to meet with other ships and have any commerce or interconnection with other ships that they met. But of course, it happened all the time. Again, to avoid paying duties or to be told that you were smuggling goods, you simply offload those goods onto another vessel. The other vessel takes it to England, someplace else, where there's not a monopoly, and the spices get sold, and you make a fortune. Easy way to do it. And then, of course, there was good old bribery. You simply buy a catarrh from an official that you're not entitled to. You pay enough money, and you can do that. Or you pay somebody enough to look the other way. Something, of course, that happens even today. You pay a customs official to look at, a box full of spices and say, oh, nice box full of cotton. Move on. Simple bribery. Now, the king would periodically get upset about this sort of thing, having created a system that was supposedly leak-proof, but in fact leaked like a sieve. And in 1616, they tried to do something about this. They actually started inspecting all the cargoes that were being brought in from Asia. So they were opening boxes, etc., and needless to say, they were finding huge amounts of contraband. But what happened then was that the merchants exploded in protest and said that they would no longer engage in the trade. The importance of this is the merchants have the capital. They have the wherewithal to finance the trade. They can send ships out, pay for the crews, etc., to go and trade and bring the stuff back, and they do that all in advance. The king needs the merchants to carry out the trade. So there are limits to which he can enforce this so-called monopoly. If he really cracks down, as he did in 1616, and the merchants get upset, the merchants turn around, sit on their hands and say, we're not going to sail anymore. We're not engaging in the trade anymore because we refuse to accept these rules. So the king has to back off, and they stop actually inspecting the bales and the bizalos, etc., that come in. So there's a certain acceptance. The state has to accept a certain amount of contraband, a certain amount of smuggling, otherwise the system won't work at all. Because built into this, the merchants have built into their basic profit margin the fact that they can do a certain amount of smuggling. The same thing applies for the lesser participants in this, the sailors. Common sailors were paid very little, and the only reason that they would sign on to these sailing vessels with high risk and they'd be gone for maybe a couple of years is because they knew that they could smuggle with a reasonable amount of security. I mean, you might have some bad luck and you happen to arrive just at a time when, you know, the king or the customs officials have been told to check everybody and you run into trouble. But generally speaking, you figure, well, if I have a little box of spice and I stuff it someplace, I can probably get off the ship and get away with it. So I'll get a reasonable amount of pay for engaging in this trade, from being involved in sailing the vessel to India or the Spice Islands and back. So it was built in at the lower level as well that people expected to be able to do a certain amount of smuggling in order to make a living out of the spice trade. The next problem is that the bureaucracy that exists is really a pre-modern bureaucracy. This is not the kind of situation where you have people taking, a civil service exam and testing to make sure they have the talents and being paid regularly and they have a secure job. This is not a modern bureaucracy. First of all, people were appointed based on their personal qualifications, and that doesn't mean professional qualifications. That means you're somebody's brother, sister, aunt, uncle who's important. We want to reward them by giving you a job. Okay, so it was based on influence. It generally tended to be true that people that got these jobs were from the elite, from the fidalgos who hold some type of noble title. They tended to get public office. Furthermore, besides the fact that you weren't necessarily picking the most honest people to begin with, or for that matter, the most qualified in terms of whatever professional talents they might have, there's the fact that public office was really viewed at that time as private property. I mean, you owned this job. In fact, very often people bought the job, so you really did own it. This was an investment for you. It'd be like buying, a franchise for a fast food chain. I paid for it, and now I'm going to make some money out of it. So it's mine. Maybe it has McDonald's or Burger King up there, but it's my place. I paid for the franchise. And the reason I have this is because I want to make money out of it. And that was the next point, that this was a money-making proposition. You expected to make money out of the job. And these jobs didn't pay anything. Very few jobs in the bureaucracy actually had a salary. So you had to ask, well, gee, why are people buying these jobs? You're buying the job because you can make money out of it. How are you going to make money out of it? You're basically going to make money out of it by being bribed, by participating yourself in the contraband trade. So another way of supporting the bureaucracy and taking care of it was seeing to it that these people got a certain piece of the trade as well. So revenues from public office were really revenues, for the most part, garnered by participating, by condoning, by looking the other way when smuggling was going on. So you don't have exactly a system made to be airtight and to prevent smuggling. All of these factors meant that, again, the Portuguese monopoly always operated with sieve-like efficiency. The simple reality that merchants expected to get their piece, sailors their piece, and bureaucrats their piece, all meant that the Portuguese would never have an airtight monopolistic system, even in their valued spice trade. Now, the last stage of this. One more European actor comes on the stage to influence the spice trade, and that is the Dutch. And we talked about the Dutch last week and their efficiency and the merchant and naval power that they became in the early modern era. Soon, they became an important element in the Portuguese trading empire because they could provide both ships and sailors in the Portuguese system, two things which the Portuguese were always short on. but it also gave the Dutch a pretty good idea of how the whole system worked. Very important. People did not have maps available to them, and particularly navigational maps that would show them how to get to places. This was information that one learned by actually sailing, whether it was to the New World, to the Spice Islands, to India. So the number of Dutchmen who sailed in Portuguese ventures meant there was a large number of Dutchmen who had gained the personal knowledge of how to get to the Indian Ocean, how to get to some place like Gujarat. And before the end of the 16th century, the Portuguese began using that information to their own benefit. Cornelis de Houtman's voyage, for example, to the East Indies was the first major venture of this type, beginning in 1595. And the idea here was supposedly to trade, but in fact, de Houtman also made a few attacks on Portuguese merchant vessels. So you could well ask, from the beginning of the Dutch intrusion, if you want to call it, into the Portuguese Empire, are they coming simply as explorers and traders, or are they coming as pirates? Well, again, the answer is sort of both. We also saw the establishment of the Dutch East India Company, and that provides, by the beginning of the 1600s, an organized, institutionalized vehicle for this continuing intrusion into the Portuguese control of the spice trade. The Dutch attack on the Casa de India and the Dutch attack on the Estado de India, meaning the Portuguese monopoly of the spice trade. They're going after the Portuguese Empire. That's what that means when I say the assault upon the Estado de India. It's really going after the Portuguese Empire, the Portuguese spice monopoly. Last time we also saw that early on they attack and capture one of the islands, one of the centers for the spice trade, and that is the capture of Amboina in 1605. So now they're moving more aggressively by the early 1600s. They're actually starting to take some of the key points. And here we have to go back briefly, one more time, to the map to look at the kinds of choke points that the Portuguese had set up. Remember, they've got Goa. They are becoming an important force in Gujarat. They have finally, after 1588, taken over Calicut, Cochin. They have controlled for some time in the 16th century Malacca. Okay? So they have a series of control points throughout the trading network for spices. And now what the Portuguese are going to do is essentially come from this direction and try to seize the very choke points that the Portuguese have used to try to control the trade. So when we look at this list that I'm going to show you, the blockade of Goa in the 1630s, trying to reduce that and capture it. Not successful, but it certainly puts a crimp in the Portuguese Empire, the fact that their key stronghold in India, Goa, is under attack. The capture of Malacca in 1641. The fall of Cochin. Again, we know for how long the Portuguese had been trading, all the way back in the early 1500s in Cochin. So all of these choke points are either under assault or being captured by the Dutch. They're taking over the key control points the Portuguese themselves had used to control the spice trade. They are particularly interested at this time in nutmeg, because it is one of the most expensive spices at this point. It is one of the rarest. It is grown largely on what's called the Banda Islands in the Spice Island chain. As the Portuguese are doing, as the Dutch are doing this, they run into their own problem. And it is namely that spices are becoming a bit of a glut on the market. That prior scarcity is no longer the case. They need to try to control the flow of spices more efficiently, more effectively, to keep the price up. One of their ways of doing that is by reducing production. And one of the ways they do that is by attacking and massacring many of the people on the Banda Islands. In other words, if you're dead, you can't grow any spices. Fewer spices, less nutmeg flowing to Europe, higher prices. So their method of price control was, to say the least, rather extreme. They, too, established themselves once again as monopolists. If they've replaced the Portuguese, they haven't changed the basic idea. In the process, they offer us a miniature version of the Portuguese before them. And that is, they themselves act in ways that are essentially piratical with their attacks on the Portuguese and attacks on merchant interests in Asia. And in creating a monopoly, they once again, inevitably, establish the basis for smuggling. And they find in the end that they too are going to be undermined by smuggling that will penetrate their so-called monopoly and eventually completely destroy it and cause the ultimate collapse of the East India Company. So for both of these European powers, but we're focused particularly on the Portuguese, the creation of a trade monopoly in spices involved piratical activities on their part and also stimulated piracy and smuggling on the part of those who found themselves being excluded from this system, and smuggling by those who were even part of the system as their way of gaining access to its profits. So how do we summarize all this? First of all, the main point today is the pirate is in the eye of the beholder, meaning you can call somebody a pirate, but depends on who you are. Meaning, for the Portuguese, the Paros, the Coon Jolly, they're all pirates because they were challenging the Portuguese system. From the viewpoint of the Paros, the Coon Jolly, the pepper growers, the Portuguese were the pirates. And the same with the Dutch. The Portuguese had entered into an area long known for centuries upon centuries for a prosperous spice trade, among other trades, and a highly multinational system where people from a variety of cultures and political entities engaged in trade. The Portuguese brought to this the European tradition of war and trade together, using warfare as a way of establishing trading routes and trading opportunities. They proceeded to seize or attempted to dominate a series of choke points, key points such as Goa, Calicut, Malacca, etc., in order to control the trade. And we're focused in particular, of course, upon Calicut and the attempt to control the spice trade, the trade in Indian pepper coming out of Calicut. In doing so, they, of course, engaged in activities that can reasonably describe them as pirates. They attacked, bombarded cities, and over the years preyed on almost any vessel that wasn't a Portuguese vessel. And this is not just the Portuguese Navy, but Portuguese merchant vessels. So the Portuguese can pretty well be described as pirates. At the same time, they would see the Coon Jolly and the Paros as pirates from their perspective. These people, of course, would say, look, you're the ones that established the monopoly. We're simply reacting to it. That's why we engage in piracy, why we engage in smuggling. So it depends upon your perspective. Whether it's Portuguese merchants, Dutch merchants, whether it's the Coon Jolly, the Paros. I say the Paros, what I mean is the vessels, but we refer to the people who use them as Paros. However we look from, it depends on our perspective whether we're looking from the side of those who were already part of the spice trade or those who were trying to control it. And each side saw in the other clear signs of piracy, and indeed each side can be seen as engaging in piracy. The reality is that the attempt of the Portuguese to establish this monopoly and to exclude people in Calicut and elsewhere, the Arab traders, etc., who had long been engaged in profitable trade in these regions, turned these people into smugglers and pirates. It was their alternative, their way to survive the creation of this trading empire in their region. In turn, what the Portuguese did in establishing monopoly prices in spices inevitably set off large-scale smuggling, not just among those already involved in the trade, but among the Portuguese themselves. Whether it's Portuguese bureaucrats, Portuguese merchants, Portuguese sailors, all contributed to punching holes in the so-called Portuguese monopoly. They used under-invoicing, in other words, saying that I've got less than I have, or it's not the product that it's labeled on the outside. It's a more expensive product. They smuggle that way. They smuggle by transshipping, shipping goods to a port where supposedly they wouldn't have to pay any taxes or would not threaten the monopoly, and then shipping those goods into the monopoly itself. The example of Angola that we gave earlier, a way of getting around the monopoly. Transshipping became another way, and of course just out-and-out bribery. Finally, contributing to this whole process were the realities of early modern bureaucracies. People got these jobs because they already were from privileged families. They often bought these jobs. They viewed them as private property, and they expected to make a profit out of the position that they held. Adding to that, of course, were merchants who were critical to the trade with Asia, who found that their profit margin depended upon their ability to smuggle, and sailors whose only way of maintaining or gaining a decent wage was to engage in smuggling. All of these factors internal to the Portuguese system contributed to widespread smuggling within the so-called monopoly. So here we have the second example today. The first we saw combative trading empires who turned to pirates, particularly the Ottomans, to advance their interests. In the Portuguese case, what we see is the attempt to enter a new area, enforce a monopoly, which encourages local people to turn to piracy and encourages even people within the monopolistic trading empire, such as bureaucrats and merchants, to turn to smuggling. So we see how the rise of trading empires in these two cases contributed to widespread smuggling in both the Mediterranean and in Asia. Next week, we'll begin to look at how the imposition of trading empires in the Caribbean leads to one of the most explosive periods of piracy in world history when we look at the pirates of the Caribbean, and we'll be doing that over several sessions. And these are some of the classic pirates, such as Blackbeard, etc., that you've long heard about and that people most readily identify as pirates. That's what we'll deal with in the next session, session number 4. Till next week.